Clara Whitfield had never been more certain of anything in her 22 years. Standing on the narrow porch of her family's modest home, she had clutched the neatly folded letter that had changed her life, the ink smudged from the many times. She had read it. "My dearest Clara," it began, the words written in a strong, confident hand. "I long for the day you step off that train and into my life." To Clara, those words were not just promises, they were salvation. Life in her tiny eastern town had always been suffocating, predictable, and painfully lonely. She was the quiet girl who spent her evenings with books instead of beaux, who mended her neighbors' hems and baked pies for the church socials but never received more than polite smiles in return. At 22, her future seemed carved in stone, spinsterhood, caring for her aging parents, and days that blended into one another without joy or meaning. Then came the ad in the newspaper. "Rancher seeks God-fearing wife to share a prosperous homestead out west. Must be of kind temperament and willing heart." She had almost laughed at the notion, but something inside her whispered that it could be her chance. One letter turned into 2, then dozens. He signed his name as Thomas, and in every letter his words painted pictures of open skies and endless opportunities, of a home where she would be cherished, needed, and loved. The day her ticket arrived, Clara felt like her life had finally begun. The whole town whispered, "Of course." Some pitied her, others envied her courage. But Clara ignored the chatter. She had packed her modest suitcase, tucked her savings into a small coin purse, and boarded the westbound train with her heart full of dreams. For 3 long days, she stared out the rattling train window, imagining her new life. A neat little house with lace curtains, a table set for 2, evenings spent beside a warm fire while Thomas read aloud to her. She pictured the children they would have, the family they would build together, and the way she would finally feel like she belonged somewhere. When the train screeched to a halt at the dusty station of Willow Creek, Clara's breath caught in her throat. This was it. Her heart pounded as she smoothed her plain blue dress and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She clutched her suitcase tightly, eyes scanning the platform for a man holding flowers or tipping his hat in her direction. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The platform emptied as families reunited and travelers went on their way. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, but no one came for her. No one called her name. The station platform had grown quiet, almost eerily so, as the final rays of sunlight slipped below the horizon. The cheerful chatter of families greeting loved ones, the stomping boots of cowhands, even the hiss of the locomotive. All of it had faded, leaving Clara alone in the encroaching twilight. She sat on the edge of a rough wooden bench, her suitcase balanced neatly at her feet, her gloved hands twisting in her lap. She tried to tell herself there was still a chance. Maybe Thomas had been delayed. Maybe his horse had thrown a shoe or some urgent ranch business had kept him from town. He would come. Of course he would come. But with each minute that ticked by, the weight in her chest grew heavier. People had begun to notice her. A pair of women, their skirts brushing the dusty platform, whispered behind their gloved hands as they cast her sidelong glances. A group of boys, no older than 12, smirked and pointed before running off into the street, their laughter echoing cruelly in her ears. Clara straightened her spine and forced her gaze forward, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her shame. Still, their stares cut deep. The station master, a balding man with a kind but tired face, lingered nearby, sweeping the same stretch of platform over and over. Every so often, he paused as though wanting to speak, but thought better of it. Clara kept her head down, wishing desperately for the courage to ask what one was supposed to do when the life they'd been promised simply didn't arrive. By the time the lanterns flickered to life along the street, the platform was nearly deserted. Clara's heart sank with the realization that she had no plan. She had spent nearly all her savings on the ticket west, trusting that the man whose letters had filled her nights with hope would be there to take care of her. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and no idea what would happen come morning, for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, tears pricked her eyes. She blinked them away, swallowing the sob that threatened to escape. Crying wouldn't help. It never had. Still, the ache in her chest was almost unbearable. She had risked everything for this chance, only to find herself abandoned and humiliated, in a strange town that suddenly felt as hostile as it did foreign. When the last wagon rattled away down the dirt road, silence settled over the station. Clara drew her shawl tighter against the cooling night air and closed her eyes, trying to imagine that she was back home in her tiny bedroom, safe and familiar instead of stranded here with nothing but the ache of betrayal to keep her company. Somewhere. Down the street, a dog barked, and a child's laughter rang faintly in the distance. Life was continuing on, oblivious to the quiet disaster that had unfolded on the empty platform. "Miss?" The voice was warm but cautious, and it startled Clara from her thoughts. She looked up to see the station master, his broom now propped against the wall, approaching her slowly, as though afraid she might bolt. His face, lined and weathered by years of sun and dust, held no judgment, only quiet concern. "You've been sitting here a good long while," he said, tugging at the brim of his hat. "Last train's come and gone. Ain't no one left but you and me. You got someplace to stay?" Clara swallowed hard, the words catching in her throat. She wanted to lie, to say that yes, of course someone was coming for her, that she wasn't. As pitiful and lost as she felt. But when she opened her mouth, the truth tumbled out instead. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. I was supposed to be met here. He didn't come." The man nodded slowly, his expression softening. "Even more. Happens more than it ought to," he murmured, almost to himself. Then louder, "Why don't you come inside the office? Got a pot of coffee still warm? You look like you could use it." Clara hesitated. She'd been raised to be cautious, to mind her manners, and to never accept charity where she couldn't repay it. But there was something steady, something kind in the man's gaze that eased her fear. She nodded, rising on trembling legs, and followed him inside. The station office was small but warm, lit by a single oil lamp that threw golden light across the cluttered desk and battered chair. The rich, earthy scent of coffee filled the room, and for the first time since stepping off the train, Clara felt a sliver of safety. The man poured her a tin cup, sliding it across the counter. "Name's Harris," he said. "Been running this station 20 years. And you?" "Clara," she murmured, wrapping her chilled hands around the cup. The warmth seeped into her fingers, calming the tremor she hadn't realized was there. Harris studied her for a moment, his brow furrowed. "Clara," he repeated. "You got folks back east?" She nodded. "Yes, but they don't know I'm here. She bit her lip, the sting of humiliation sharp in her chest. "I was supposed to be married." Harris sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Ain't right what some men do. But you'll be all right, Miss Clara. This town looks out for its own, even the ones just passing through." His kindness cracked something in her. She blinked back tears, forcing herself to sip the bitter coffee to keep from breaking entirely. The little girl hesitated in the doorway, her tiny frame silhouetted by the faint glow of the lanterns outside. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, small for her age, with tangled brown curls and a faded gingham dress that had seen better days. In her arms, she clutched a worn rag doll, its button eyes loose and threadbare from years of love. Harris straightened in his chair. "Emily," he said, his gruff voice softening. "What are you doing out this late? Your papa know you're wandering around?" Emily didn't answer him. Her eyes, the color of warm hazel with golden flecks, were fixed on Clara. There was something steady and knowing in that gaze, far too old for such a young face. Slowly, timidly, she stepped inside, her little boots tapping softly against the wooden floor. Clara set down her coffee, unsure what to make of the child's quiet inspection. "Hello," she said gently, forcing her lips into what she hoped was a reassuring smile. "I'm Clara." Emily hugged the doll tighter. "You're sad," she said simply, her voice a whisper, as if stating a fact. "I could tell from the bench." Clara's throat tightened. She hadn't realized how plainly her heartbreak must have shown to everyone, how utterly exposed she must have seemed sitting there on that bench, with her whole world unraveling. She tried to find words, to offer some polite denial, but Emily barreled on. "My papa needs you," the little girl said, her tone matter-of-fact, as though she were offering a solution as simple as a cup of tea. "He doesn't know it yet, but he does." The room went still. Harris blinked, his weathered brows shooting up toward his thinning hairline. "Now, Emily." But Emily shook her head stubbornly, her curls bouncing. She stepped closer to Clara, her small hands gripping the doll so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You're kind," she whispered. "I can tell. And you don't have anywhere to go. We have a house. Papa says it's too big now. You could stay." Clara stared, utterly speechless. For a fleeting moment, she thought perhaps the child had mistaken her for someone else, some family friend or distant cousin. But the earnestness in those hazel eyes said otherwise. This child, this stranger, had looked at her and somehow decided she belonged. Something warm and strange stirred in Clara's chest, cutting through the heavy fog of despair. For the first time since stepping off that train, she didn't feel invisible or foolish. She felt seen. Harris cleared his throat, rubbing the back of his neck. "Emily, sweetheart, your papa might have something to say about inviting strangers home." Emily tilted her chin in defiance, her tiny jaw set with determination far beyond her years. "Then tell him," she said firmly, "that she's the one Mama would have wanted." Clara followed Emily out of the station office, her suitcase clutched tightly in one hand and her heart pounding in her chest. The evening air had turned sharp, the stars pricking the inky sky like tiny diamonds. Emily marched ahead with all, the confidence of someone who believed the world would bend to her will, her little boots kicking up soft puffs of dust as they walked toward the edge of town. "Papa's over here," Emily announced, glancing back to make sure Clara was keeping up. "He's getting feed. Don't worry, he's nice. Mostly." Clara tried to smile, though her nerves fluttered wildly. What was she doing? Following a stranger, worse, a stranger's child, through a town she'd never seen before? But there had been something about the way Emily had looked at her, a quiet certainty that had made it impossible to say no. They stopped in front of the blacksmith's shop, where the warm glow of lamplight spilled out into the dirt street. Tall man stood near the hitching post, his broad shoulders outlined against the light. His hat was pushed low over his brow, and his work shirt clung to him in the evening heat, sleeves rolled to his elbows to reveal forearms corded with muscle. He was murmuring something to the shopkeeper when Emily let out a delighted squeal. "Papa!" The man turned, his expression sharpening when his eyes landed on his daughter and then on Clara. He didn't speak at first, just studied her with a mixture of curiosity and quiet caution. "Emily," he said, his voice deep and steady, "what did I tell you about wandering off at night?" Emily ignored the question, darting forward to grab his hand and tug him toward Clara. "Papa," she said breathlessly, "this is Clara. She doesn't have anywhere to go, and you need her. I told her so." Clara felt her face flush with embarrassment. I'm sorry," she stammered. "I didn't mean to impose. Your daughter, she was very kind, and I didn't want her walking alone in the dark." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in the careful assessing way of someone used to weighing risk. Finally, he tipped his hat. "Luke Turner," he said, gruffly. "Emily's my girl, and you are—" "Clara Whitfield," she replied softly, clutching her suitcase a little tighter. There was a pause, heavy with unspoken questions, before Luke sighed and ran a hand over the back of his neck. "Well, Miss Whitfield," he said, his tone softening a fraction, "Emily's right about one thing. The ranch is too big for just the two of us. You're welcome to supper. You can figure the rest out from there." Clara woke the next morning, to the scent of coffee and the distant clatter of hooves in the corral. For a moment, disoriented, she blinked at the low wooden ceiling above her. Then the memories of the night before tumbled back, Emily's plea, Luke's reluctant offer of supper, and the quiet, bumpy wagon ride to the ranch under a quilt of stars. The room Emily had led her to was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a quilt neatly folded at the foot, and a single window overlooking the yard. It wasn't much, but to Clara, who had spent the last 24 hours feeling adrift and unwanted, it felt like a sanctuary. She dressed quickly, smoothing her skirt and tying her hair back with trembling hands. She didn't want to be a burden. If she was to stay, at least for a little while, she needed to be useful. She followed the smell of coffee to the kitchen, where she found Emily perched on a stool, her little legs swinging as she devoured a piece of toast dripping with honey. Luke stood by the stove, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "Morning," he said, his deep voice even but guarded. "Hope you slept all right?" "Yes, thank you," Clara replied, her voice soft. "I'd be happy to help with breakfast." Luke studied her for a moment, then gave a slight nod toward the cupboard. "Biscuits need making if you know how." By the time the biscuits were in the oven, Clara's nerves had begun to settle. The simple act of working, of measuring, flour, rolling dough, and stoking the fire felt grounding. When Emily chattered happily about the horses and the ranch dog, Clara found herself smiling for the first time since stepping off that train. The day was a blur of learning. She helped Emily with her reading, mended a torn shirt for Luke, and followed the child around the property as she pointed out every detail of her world: the hen house, the pond where frogs liked to sing at dusk, the old apple tree that would bloom in spring. By evening, Clara's muscles ached, her skirt was dust-streaked, and her hands smelled faintly of lavender soap. But she felt something she hadn't in a very long time. She felt needed. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, Clara lingered on the porch with a cup of tea. The air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of sagebrush and earth. Across the yard, Luke was coiling a length of rope, his movements efficient and quiet. For a moment their eyes met, and though neither spoke, Clara felt a strange warmth bloom in her chest. Clara hadn't meant to notice him. Truly, she hadn't. But over the next few weeks, as she settled into life at the ranch, Luke Turner became impossible to ignore. It was in the quiet moments, mostly, like the mornings when she'd rise before, dawn to start the biscuits, only to find he'd already been out in the barn, sweat darkening the back of his shirt as he worked. Or the evenings when he'd return, dust clinging to his boots, his hat tipped low, and a tired but soft look in his eyes when Emily ran to greet him. At first, Clara kept her distance. She told herself she was just a guest, a temporary presence, in a house that wasn't hers. She focused on helping Emily with her lessons, on tending the small kitchen garden, on keeping the house running smoothly. But then there were the moments that caught her off guard. Like the afternoon a storm rolled in sudden and fast, the kind that painted the sky black and sent the horses skittering nervously in their stalls. Clara had rushed outside, skirts hiked, to her knees, to help Luke secure the chicken coop. They'd been nearly drenched by the time they made it back to the porch, breathless and laughing, rain dripping from their hair. "You've got grit," he'd said, his voice warm with something that made her stomach flutter. Or the evening she'd sliced her finger while chopping vegetables. She'd tried to wave it off, but Luke had taken her hand gently in his, wrapping it with a clean strip of linen and muttering about how she needed to be more careful. She'd caught herself staring at his hands, calloused, steady, capable, and had to force herself to look away. Emily noticed, of course. Children always did. One evening, as Clara tucked her into bed, Emily whispered conspiratorially, "Papa likes you. He watches you when you don't see." Clara's cheeks had burned. "Emily Turner," she'd scolded gently, though her heart thudded in her chest. "Your papa is simply being kind." But the truth was, Luke's kindness felt different. It wasn't the hollow flattery she'd once mistaken for love in those letters from the man who had abandoned her. It was quieter, steadier, a respect that showed in small ways, in the way he always saved the last slice of pie for her, in how he checked the porch steps for loose boards after she nearly tripped, in how his voice softened when he asked about her family back east. At night, lying in her narrow bed, Clara found herself thinking about him, about the way the lines at the corners of his eyes deepened when he smiled, about the strength in his silence and the gentleness beneath it. It came in the form of a letter, as if the ghost of her former life had reached across the miles to find. Clara discovered it one bright morning while sweeping the porch. Harris, the station master, had sent a boy from town with the day's mail. Among the ranch's usual deliveries, a notice about feed prices, a catalog for farm equipment, was an envelope addressed in a familiar hand. Her broom slipped from her fingers, clattering to the porch boards. Thomas. Her breath caught as she traced the bold, slanted letters of her name. For a moment, the world around her blurred, and she was back on the eastbound train, heart fluttering with dreams of love and new beginnings. But then she remembered the long, empty platform, the pitying looks, the humiliation of being left behind. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. "Dearest Clara," the letter began. "I was a fool. Circumstances beyond my control kept me from meeting you, but I have regretted it every day since. If you will forgive me, I want you to come home, to the home I've prepared for you here. I promise you a good life, if only you'll return." The paper blurred as tears welled in her eyes, not from longing, but from the painful sting of old wounds reopening. She crumpled the letter in her fist and shoved it deep into her apron pocket, desperate to keep it hidden. The rest of the day passed in a haze. She burned the biscuits, forgot to collect the eggs, and startled every time Luke's quiet baritone drifted through the house. Emily, ever perceptive, tilted her head at Clara's forced smiles, but said nothing. That night, when the house had gone still and the only sound was the distant chirping of crickets, Clara sat by the small desk in her room, the letter smoothed, flat before her. She read it again and again, searching for something she couldn't quite name, an apology that felt true, a promise that didn't ring hollow. But all she found were empty words. Yet doubt crept in. What if she was being foolish here, clinging to a life that wasn't really hers? She was a guest in Luke's home, nothing more. Sooner or later she would have to leave. Down the hall, a floorboard creaked softly. She glanced up to see Emily's, little face peeking around the doorframe, her doll tucked under one arm. "Can't sleep," Emily whispered. "Papa says sometimes when your heart feels heavy, it helps to sit on the porch and look at the stars. Want me to come with you?" Clara's throat tightened. She managed a trembling smile and nodded, tucking the letter away. The letter sat folded on her bedside table for 3 days, its presence a constant weight in Clara's mind. Every time she passed by, her eyes flicked to it, her thoughts tangling in a web of what-ifs and maybes. What if she was making a mistake? By staying? What if this tender, quiet life she'd begun to build with Luke and Emily wasn't truly hers to claim? On the fourth evening, Clara found herself in the barn, the dim light of the lantern casting soft shadows on the rough wood. She had come to check on one of the mares recovering from a strained leg, but her mind wasn't on the animal. Luke was there, leaning against a post, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, his hat dangling from one hand. He looked up as she entered, his gaze steady calm, yet somehow questioning. "You've been quiet," he said simply, his deep voice low. Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of her apron. I got a letter," she admitted. "From the man who was supposed to meet me at the station." Luke's jaw tensed almost imperceptibly, but he said nothing, waiting for her to go on. "He says he wants me to come back. That he's sorry." Her voice trembled. "Part of me wonders if I should. I don't belong here, Luke. Not really, I'm just passing through." There was a long silence. Then Luke stepped closer, his boots scuffing softly against the packed dirt floor. When he spoke, his tone was quiet but sure. "You've been here near 2 months," he said. "This place, Emily, me, we're better for it. Doesn't feel like you're just passing through to us." The words hit her like a soft blow, unbalancing her carefully built walls. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Instead, her eyes met his, and in that still, quiet space, she saw everything she'd been too afraid to acknowledge. The steady strength, the quiet longing, the unspoken offer of a life that was real, solid, and hers for the choosing. Later that night, after Emily had gone to bed, Clara sat at her desk and unfolded the letter one last time. She read the words, felt the sting of their emptiness, and finally understood. Thomas hadn't wanted her. He had wanted the idea of her, a woman to fill the empty spaces in his life. With steady hands, Clara struck a match, touched it to the edge of the paper, and watched as the flames curled and consumed it. By the time only ashes remained, a strange sense of peace had settled over her. The next morning, Clara found Luke in the corral, mending a broken gate. She didn't hesitate this time. She walked right up to him, her heart steady and sure, and, when he looked up, surprise flashing in his eyes, she smiled, small but certain. "I'm not leaving," she said softly. If you'll have me." The ranch had always been busy, but that morning felt different. The air was alive with quiet joy, though no one spoke of it. The sun rose golden over the hills, the dew clinging to the tall grasses like tiny diamonds, and the distant lowing of cattle drifted through the crisp air. Clara stood on the porch, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, watching as Emily darted across the yard to chase the barn cat. She smiled at the sound of the girl's laughter, clear and bright, the kind of sound that made the world feel softer. Luke was by the corral, checking the latch on the gate, but Clara could feel his presence as surely as she felt the sun on her skin. He glanced up, caught her watching him, and for the briefest moment, their eyes locked. It was the same look they'd shared in the barn that night, the same unspoken promise that had shifted the course of her life. It had been weeks since she'd burned the letter. Weeks since she'd told him, simply and surely, that she was staying. Since then, something between them had changed. Slowly, quietly, but undeniably. He still said little, still kept his feelings tucked away like a well-guarded treasure. But there were moments now, his hand brushing hers as they passed in the kitchen, the way his voice softened when he said her name, the warmth in his gaze. When he found her reading to Emily by the fire, Clara had found her rhythm here. The days were full, feeding chickens, mending clothes, tending the garden, but the work never felt heavy. In the evenings, she'd sit on the porch steps with Emily, shelling peas or snapping beans, listening as Luke's deep voice drifted across the yard while he finished his chores. She'd learned that the ranch, with its endless chores and unpredictable days, had a way of humbling a person, but it had also taught her something she hadn't known she needed, that home wasn't a place built of walls and promises. It was the people who stood beside you, steady and true. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of rose and gold, they ate supper together. Luke at one end of the table, Emily chattering happily in the middle, and Clara opposite him, her heart full. Later, when Emily had been tucked into bed and the house had gone quiet, Clara stepped onto the porch again. Luke was there, leaning against the railing, the soft light from the lantern catching the edges of his face. He turned at her footsteps, his expression unreadable for a moment, then softened. "You belong here," he said simply, his voice low but certain. Clara's breath caught, and for the first time, she didn't question it. She just stepped closer, her heart steady and sure, and let the truth of his words settle deep in her soul. Here, in this quiet place with a man who saw her and a little girl who loved her, Clara had finally found what she'd been searching for all along.